Our scripture reading this morning is from the book of Genesis, chapter 12, verses 1 through 9. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you. I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." So Abram went, as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Abram took his wife Sarai and his brother's son Lot, and all the possessions that they had gathered, and the persons whom they had acquired in Haran, and they set forth to go to the land of Canaan. When they had come to the land of Canaan, Abram passed through the land to the place at Shechem, to the oak of Moreh. At that time the Canaanites were in the land. Then the Lord appeared to Abram and said, "To your offspring I will give this land." So he built there an altar to the Lord who had appeared to him. From there he moved on to the hill country on the east of Bethel, and pitched his tent, with Bethel on the west and Ai on the east. And there he built an altar to the Lord and invoked the name of the Lord. And Abram journeyed on by stages toward Negeb.
So the scripture that Ellie read is the movement of Abraham and Sarah, or the characters we come to know as Abraham and Sarah, from one place to another. It starts in a place that they had known as home, and God moves them many times. And this is just the beginning of a series of moves that they make throughout their lives. One of my favorite tellings of this scripture comes from Children Worship and Wonder. It's a UCC curriculum for our youngest members. A lot of congregations will use it as a worship time for children if they have a large number. And using what they call a desert box, a small portable sandbox and little wooden silhouette figures, the children hear these words. Each time they pack up and leave, they are convinced God won't go with them. Each time they arrive in a new place, they are surprised to find that God is already there. And Abram and Sarai are so happy to find God in each new place that they stop what they're doing. They stack rocks to make an altar because they can't help but to give thanks to God. Because they can't help but give thanks to God. One of my favorite experiences with this story is kind of a spinoff of the Worship and Wonder story. Ben, my son, was about 4 when he was invited to his best friend Sarah's princess birthday party. He was the only boy there in a sea of hair, tiaras, and shiny fabric. But the children vibrating, playing out in the backyard on this playground was more of a scene if you imagine Looney Tunes' Tasmanian Devil. It was a swirl of energy and dust and children going just slow enough that if you looked closely, you could pick out your child in the fray. But at some point, we realized that Ben and Sarah were no longer in the mob. We started looking around and discovered that they were off on their own under the slide in the sandbox. They were stacking rocks. One of the parents, caught off by this change in mood and energy level, asked them, what are you all doing over here? And Sarah, always the one to speak for the two of them, said, we're stacking rocks. Why? The curious mom continued, and Sarah explained, it's a special day. We have to stop and thank God. As I look back at my own life, I have a couple of literal rocks that remind me of God's presence. One is the formation of rocks just north of the downtown boardwalk in Laguna. I would drive down there during college to watch the tide come in around me. It was a chance for the white noise of the ocean to drown out all my other thoughts and worries. It was a chance for me to sit just with God. And I give thanks for those moments. But there was another rock that prepared me for that one, that prepared me to understand what it meant to just sit with God. I was not much different in age than Ben and Sarah in their sandbox when my family had moved into the woods. Now, real woods in eastern Kentucky, not just property with a bunch of trees in the back, but real woods. My dad had set up a large rock where our yard met the line of the woods. He called it my thinking rock, and I would sit there before I ventured into the woods to play or to go on an adventure. I would sit there when I was mad about something, pretending I might run away. I would sit there when I didn't know how to feel about things, or if I just wanted somebody to talk to, and my parents were done hearing my stories for the third time. Sitting with me was my imaginary friend, Snort the bear. My dad had introduced me to Snort when we first moved there, assuring me that nothing in the woods was bigger than Snort, and so I didn't have to be afraid. Snort would sit with me, and I give thanks for those chats. Not because it was so good to have an imaginary friend as an only child, but this is where I discovered what prayer was and could be, even if I didn't know it at the time. That rock, as much as it was a solid base that I sat on, it shaped me as I watched the water come around and shape those rocks in Laguna. And as I realized how the story of the rocks had shaped my own child and his church experience. My time on the rocks in Laguna echoed the prayers of my childhood, and that echo has resounded since then in church sanctuaries, in emergency rooms, in family homes, sharing sacred moments as a church family. The presence of God has lingered thick in the air at church camps and on ball fields. That same God that met Abraham and Sarah, that same God that Sarah and Ben knew to be with them in the sandbox, that same God that has met you at your special moments, times of crisis, the same God that pounds in our chest on those days of anticipation, of celebration. That same God is with us in this moment, in this sacred space. And as we name God's presence, we are shaped by it. As we pause and give thanks, we are changed by it. In this sacred space, whether it is where you are sitting, whether it is the space between each of us, the miles and the gigabytes, we are reminded, humbled by the enormity of God's presence. And it's hard to not stop and give thanks. I wonder, where are you on your journey with God? Are you at the beginning of a new chapter, feeling called to step away from the familiar, seeking the courage to go? Are you on your way, wondering what might unfold as you push forward? Are you mapping a new space, building a new normal, seeking God's presence of stability? Are you settled in, making your place, your space, and this time in your life home? Maybe a little worried of where God might call you out next. Wherever you might be, wherever you are on the journey, I wonder if you've stopped to notice that God is with you. I wonder what calls you to stop and notice God with you. If we stop and notice, we find the courage to do more, to go, to follow the call. When we stop and notice, our wandering becomes wondering, and possibilities trump fears. When we stop and notice, new places feel like familiar spaces, and we know that we are not alone. When we stop and notice, we know God is with us, and we cannot help but stop and give thanks. This can be done in a lot of ways. Sometimes it's opening our minds and our hearts in prayer. Sometimes it's naming our blessings in the face of our worries. Sometimes it's serving others in response to all that God has provided for us. And sometimes it's as simple as stacking rocks and saying thank you. So since it's that easy, I want to invite you to reflect on what reminds you of God's presence. Maybe you're able to be out hiking today during worship or sitting in nature. Maybe it's a person or people that always remind you of God's presence. Maybe it's a devotion or a prayer time that you set up to structure your spiritual life. Maybe it's treasured memories that are never far away, ready to be brought out and held on to as precious stones. What reminds you of God's presence? And then as we are reminded of what calls us to recognize God among us, how do we celebrate it? How do you celebrate God's presence with you? Maybe it's acts of service. Maybe it's singing. Maybe it's sharing love with others. Maybe it's cooking or crafting or thinking or fidgeting. What is it you do to celebrate God's presence around you? Maybe it's spending time in worship. Or maybe it's as simple as stacking rocks. I want to give you some time. We always have our meditative moment afterwards, but I want to give you some time with these two questions to think a little more. What things remind you of God's presence? What awakens your eyes, your consciousness to God around you? If you've not felt God in a long time, what did it for you when you were younger? Kids are always more connected to the presence of bigger things than we are as adults. Sometimes the life just seems to distract us so much. So where is it that reminds you of God's presence, or what used to? And how do we celebrate it? What do we do in response to that presence?